Hello everyone and welcome back to Scary Stories channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Story 1. In the same village of Black Hollow, not far from the Cursed Hollow Manor, there was an old abandoned schoolhouse. The school had been closed for decades, ever since a tragic fire claimed the lives of several children and their teacher. The villagers avoided the place, believing it to be haunted by the spirits of the lost children. But to a group of curious teenagers, the schoolhouse was the perfect spot for a dare. One chilly autumn evening, 4 friends, Jake, Mia, Ryan, and Sarah, decided to spend the night in the schoolhouse. They had heard the stories, of course, but they didn't believe in ghosts. To them, it was just a creepy old building, and they were determined to prove that there was nothing to fear. As they approached the schoolhouse, the air grew colder, and a thick fog rolled in, shrouding the building in an eerie mist. The windows were broken and the door hung crookedly on its hinges. The friends hesitated for a moment, but Jake, the boldest of the group, pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior of the schoolhouse was dark and damp, with peeling wallpaper and a floor covered in debris. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet. The friends turned on their flashlights and began to explore, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. They found the classroom where the fire had started. The walls were blackened with soot, and the desks were charred and overturned. In the corner of the room, they saw a small, child-sized handprint burned into the wall. Mia reached out to touch it, but Ryan grabbed her arm. "Don't," he said, his voice trembling. "This place gives me the creeps." As they continued to explore, they began to hear faint, high-pitched laughter coming from the shadows. The sound sent chills down their spines, but they tried to brush it off as their imagination playing tricks on them. They decided to set up camp in the gymnasium, where the ceiling was partially collapsed, allowing a sliver of moonlight to filter through. They spread out their sleeping bags and tried to make themselves comfortable, but the laughter continued, growing louder and more persistent. As the night wore on, the friends began to feel as though they were being watched. The shadows in the corners of the gym seemed to move, and the temperature dropped sharply. Sarah, who was sitting closest to the door, suddenly screamed and pointed toward the entrance. Standing in the doorway was a small, shadowy figure, a child no more than 8 years old. Its skin was pale and translucent, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. The child smiled, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The friends scrambled to their feet, their hearts pounding. More children began to appear, emerging from the shadows and surrounding them. The children's laughter echoed through the gym, a sound that was both innocent and horrifying. Jake tried to reason with the children, but they only laughed harder. Mia grabbed a piece of broken wood from the floor and brandished it like a weapon, but the children didn't seem to notice. They began to close in, their eyes fixed on the friends with a hungry, predatory gaze. Ryan and Sarah tried to run, but the children moved with unnatural speed, blocking their path. The friends were trapped, surrounded by the hollow-eyed spirits of the lost children. As the children reached out to touch them, the friends felt a cold, numbing sensation spread through their bodies. Their vision blurred and they could no longer move. The last thing they saw was the children's faces, twisted into grotesque grins, before everything went black. The next morning, the villagers found the schoolhouse empty. The friends' belongings were scattered across the gym floor, but there was no sign of them. The only clue was a series of small, child-sized handprints burned into the walls, leading to the spot where the friends had last been seen. The villagers knew better than to investigate further. They sealed the schoolhouse and left it to rot, a grim reminder of the horrors that lurked within. But on quiet nights when the moon was full and the wind howled through the trees, the villagers could still hear the faint, high-pitched laughter of the hollow children, echoing from the abandoned schoolhouse. Story 2. This happened to me just a bit over a year ago. I'm 24 and have a townhouse in the suburbs. I live alone, which for me gets really boring, so I try to have friends over whenever I can. My closest friends come a couple times a week and sometimes even sleep over to escape their parents' houses. I didn't have any plans this night, but I had plans for the next day with my friend Sarah, who was supposed to be coming over to have a movie night. So I really was just trying to get this night over with and looking forward to the next day. I went to bed early, like 9:15. In the middle of the night, I woke up. I looked at my nightstand and saw it was 2 a.m., by the way. I woke up was odd. My heart was pounding for some reason and my brain was very alert and aware, like something was happening. I thought maybe I'd just woken up from a nightmare or something until I heard a click from downstairs. I sat off a door, slowly screeched out, fed, and I could hear someone's footsteps entering my home. Although terrified, I thought this had to be Sarah or one of my other friends, as they all had keys to my house in case they needed somewhere to stay. I got up from my bed and walked over to the door opening. Each and stepping into the hallway, Sarah. No one responded. I waited in the hallway for what felt like forever, but then a bright light suddenly flickered on, lighting up the whole downstairs. A second later, soft chattering noise came from the living room. Whoever it was had turned on the TV. For a moment, I felt relief, thinking it was definitely one of my friends who had one too many drinks. I went down the stairs and into the living room and felt my whole body turn ice cold in an instant. Some random man was sitting on my couch looking at the TV screen. He looked to maybe 50 years old with patchy long black hair and dirty clothes. As I stared at him in fear, he glanced over at me and showed a crooked smile, then waved his hand as if to invite me over to the couch. I turned around and sprinted right out the front door. I banged on my neighbor's door until they let me in and called the police. By the time they made it, though, he was gone, no trace of him at all. And what's worse is the police didn't take it all that seriously, suggesting it was probably just some harmless homeless man wanting a place to sleep. The way I see it, everything points to otherwise. He picked the lock on my door, sat on my couch, and turned on the TV. Then the sick man smiled at me and invited me over to the couch. I think he may have been a stalker, something, and now I find it hard to even sleep at night when I'm alone, thinking that there's a chance that I'm not really alone. Story 3. When I was 19, I worked as an Uber driver. I hadn't figured out quite what I wanted to do with my life yet, so I hadn't started college or anything. I was just doing who were to pay my bills until I could figure it all out. This night I was driving from 7 p.m. to 3 a.m., or that's what I was planning to do. Most other drivers weren't working around those times when I was always more of a night person, so this was just when I liked to work. Around 11, I picked up a lady from a bar and drove 35 minutes away to drop her off at home. It was pretty much at the edge of the city in a much more secluded and quiet area. After that, another pickup request came through from somewhere 10 minutes away. I was reluctant to accept it because the drop-off location wasn't back toward the city, but instead further routes. I still ended up accepting it, then just hoped that the next person would be going towards the city, where there would likely be more work. I pulled onto the road and started driving to the pickup spot. The road to get there was through a bunch of farmland and not much else. It was pretty empty. Have any other cars to... Once I got to last turn, it was down. A thin dirt road going between of the old of tall grass or wheat. At the end, I could see a farmhouse on top of a small hill. That was the location that the app said they were at. I pulled up and parked in the open grass just in front of the house. The lights were off and nobody was outside. After a few seconds, I lightly halt to let them know I was here. I had my windows rolled down and the crops blowing around and the wind was really loud. I only say that because a sudden tap on the passenger door startled me. I hadn't thought to look back at the road I just came from because I obviously assumed it would be coming from the house. The man leaned his head through the open window and looked at me. There was a strange moment as he held a straight face and said nothing before I spoke, asking if he was the one who ordered that Uber. His eyes moved to the back seat, looking around before he nodded and looked back at me. Can you help me carry something out to the car? Technically, being at work, my reactive answer was sure, and assuming it was just some luggage or something. But I quickly regret answering without thinking about it. He began walking toward the house, so I got out of the car and followed loosely behind him. Once he got up to the porch, he opened the door and somewhat rushed inside, without even looking back at me. As I matched his pace and got onto the porch, the wide open door showed an empty hallway with still no lights turned on, and the man was nowhere to be seen. I couldn't even hear any footsteps of him walking around. Standing there, an eerie feeling loomed over me. Sure, I called out. The house remained quiet with no response or movement from inside. Past the doorway, I quickly felt a nearly pitch black in with it being really quiet there. There was no way I was going in there. I turned and ran back to my car, then drove back through the field and down to the main road, canceling the Uber. My biggest regret from that night was not saying anything. I thought since nothing happened, I had no good reason to notify the police, but every time I think back on it, there seems to be less of a chance that it wasn't something horrible. I even looked up some information on the farmhouse about a month after this happened, and all I could find was that there was last sold in the 1960s. So the man I saw almost definitely wasn't the owner. He probably didn't even live there. What was waiting for me inside that house, and I followed him in his something I'll never know for sure. Story 4. I've owned and lived in the same house for 8 years. It's a normal family-sized home, which was relevant when I had roommates, but when they moved out and it just became me living here, I had nothing to do with the extra space. It was technically a 4-bedroom house, but I only used to have the bedrooms. One is my main bedroom and one is the gaming room. The other 2 rooms were on the far end of the upstairs hallway. One had a few storage boxes in it and the other was completely empty. After getting out of work, at 9 I picked up Wendy's on the way home in Pretty. Much went right to the game room. I was off tomorrow, so what better to do than game all night. I pulled my headphones on and loaded up COD. But before I had time to even load into a match, I thought I heard something that sounded like a knock at the front door. I took my headset off and listened, but not hearing anything and figuring they would have knocked again. If there was someone there, I went back to my game. Probably a whole 2 hours went by and then I heard it again. It sounded like either a knock or a door closing or something like that. But with my headphones on and with my room door closed, it was way too quiet for me to tell. I got up and opened the door, looking out into the hallway and waiting for that sound to come again. After a minute, though, I went downstairs and looked out the front door. Nobody was outside my house and everything seemed normal, having been hearing these sounds, though I obviously made sure the door was locked before going back upstairs to be a bit more cautious. I left my room door open this time, so if it happened again, maybe I'd hear it better. I put my headset back on and continued gaming. I played through a whole round, so like 20-ish minutes. As the game ended and I leaned back in my chair, a figure rushed past the open doorway just off to the side of my view. I immediately threw my headphones off and jumped from my chair. Horrified and unsure what to do, I just stared at the doorway. I didn't get the courage to finally move for several minutes. When I looked into the hallway, though, and eventually the rest of the house, nobody was there, but the front door was unlocked again. When police came and investigated, it was clear that the person had been hiding, and very likely living in the empty room. I hadn't been in there for weeks or maybe even months, so all this time, they could have been just on the other side of the wall from me and I had no idea. And it's really scary to think about, especially if I had happened to confront him. There's no saying what he would have done. Story 4. My wife and I take yearly vacations to different places. It's our way of taking a break from regular, everyday life, as well as getting to spend some quality time together. This year we had a cabin booked in Washington State. It was far out and described online as being quiet and peaceful, away from any other places or people. Most of our life is in crowded cities, so this sounded great for us. When we walked to a grocery store to pick up what we needed, then took a taxi out to the cabin. We didn't rent a car because we knew we'd only be there for 3 days, so we wanted to spend it just at the cabin, and if we changed our minds or needed anything else, we could always just order an over. The taxi ride was just over an hour from the town. We landed and most of the drive was between huge mountain ranges and tree-covered landscape. It was really beautiful and got us both excited for our stay. Then at just about 7 p.m. we arrived at the cabin. It was completely alone in the middle of the forest. Even the driveway leading to it wasn't much more than some tire tracks in the dirt. We got out and paid the taxi, then brought our stuff inside. The cabin itself was small. There was the main floor that had the kitchen and living room with a ladder leading up to a loft area that had the bed in it. The bed area on the loft was short, though. You literally had to crawl into the bed, kind of like one you'd see in a tiny home. Anyway, we unpacked the groceries, made a very quick dinner since we were tired from the flight. Then we opened a bottle of wine to settle in for the night. We lit up the fireplace and chatted about how we were looking forward to the next few days. It was around 11 p.m. at this point, and as we talked, we both suddenly heard something outside. Someone was walking in the grass near the cabin. It was loud, like they were really close. My wife looked nervous, so I tried to put a brave face on and told her it was fine. I got up and looked out the window. It wasn't until then that I realized how dark it had gotten outside. I looked around, seeing nothing but large trees everywhere and pitch black darkness around them. I told her I didn't see anyone that went over to the front door and opened it, stepping onto the porch and turning on the outdoor lights. All I could really see out there was a small portion of the driveway, but I didn't see anyone there either. The forest was very calm and quiet too, so if they were still walking around, I felt like I would have been able to hear them. I went back inside and asked my wife if she heard the footsteps anymore. Why, she said the sounds didn't seem to fade out, it just stopped suddenly from somewhere behind the cabin. My brave act was starting to fall through, and I told her to go up to the loft and stay quiet while I figured out what was going on. I went around and checked all the windows again, not seeing anything, so I went back to the front door. I was preparing myself to go back outside when a sudden thump shook the cabin. I looked up, and my wife, who was looking up at the ceiling, someone was on the roof of the cabin. I stayed inside and called the police, going over lengthy directions on how to get to the cabin we were at over the course of the hour, and we had to wait. We could occasionally hear a few footsteps walking across the top of the cabin. About 45 minutes into the wait, though, we heard their boots hit the ground, followed by them calmly walking away. I looked out the window once more, seeing their outline disappearing into the forest. Police took our report and gave us a ride into town, where we spent the rest of our vacation. What that person was doing miles away from civilization, in the middle of a forest, is terrifying, seeing as they were likely waiting for us to either go to bed or go outside. We're just thankful that we got out of there before something else could have happened. Story 5. This was a few months ago while driving for DoorDash. I only drive as a side gig, maybe 10 to 15 hours a week. This night there was only doing a couple orders since it was already late, and I'd picked up a small order around 1 a.m. It was to be delivered to a business building somewhere across town, which was apparent by the address. This was a normal thing usually for overnight workers or whatever. When I pulled into the parking lot, though it was empty, no cars at all, and it didn't look like there was a parking lot behind the building either. I parked in a spot near the front and got out with the food. The place was definitely an office building of some kind and was smaller than most, being only 2 stories and not very wide. All the lights were off in the windows, though aside from one lights behind the front door. I walked up to the door and checked the app, seeing it has specific drop-off instructions to enter the main hallway and leave the bag outside of room 232. I looked through the door in the building, seeing this hallway with a bunch of closed doors on either side, delivering to specific rooms I'd only done at hotels, so this was kind of new for me. I tested the door, pushing on it, and there was unlocked, so I stepped inside. I expected to hear people working, moving around or talking, but instead didn't hear anything. There wasn't a single sound in the whole building. It was just white noise from the overhead, lights buzzing above me. As I passed the first few doors, though, they were all numbers in the 100s, like 102 and 106. The room, the instructions said the leave it at was in the 200s, so I assumed that meant it was on the second floor. In the middle of the hallway was the doorway leading to the staircase. It was held open with a wedge doorstop stopper on the floor, but the lights weren't on. I stepped in and up to the bottom of the staircase, then looked up. The whole stairwell was pitch black. Not even any light was coming from above where the room was supposed to be for me to drop it off. That again, I started to notice the eerie silence, and it sent a chill through me. I was always one to do whatever the instructions say, so I'd get good reviews, but this was the first time. I told myself that this was too sketchy. I stepped out of the stairwell and back into the hallway. And just as I dared, the door right across from me opened. The lights in that room were off, but a man emerged from behind the door and stepped into the hallway. He was wearing street clothes and just didn't look like an office worker at all. He stood in front of me and pointed past me at the stairwell. 232 is up there. I nodded but didn't move, and neither did he. He just looked me in the eyes with a look like he was suppressing his anger. After an intense few seconds, I dropped the bag on the ground and started quickly walking to the exit. The man didn't follow me, but I heard his footsteps go into the stairwell and up the stairs as I left the building. I got in my car and left. I didn't know what that was or if I was maybe overreacting about it, so I didn't call the police. The following day, though, the police actually called me. Apparently, the office reported a break-in in the CCTV footage. They saw my car and license plate tracking it back to me. They also had footage of the break-in, and so they called me in to question me about any information I might have. I didn't have much to give, but it turned out there were actually 3 people that broke inside. One was downstairs who I saw, but the other 2 were shown on the cameras to be hiding at the top of the stairs, seemingly waiting for me to go up. Disturbingly, several other delivery orders were made to that same office that night. All of the other drivers were smarter than I was, though, leaving the orders outside by the front door. What would have taken place in that office? Had any of us gone up to the second floor is unknown, but hopefully police can find the 3 men before anyone falls victim to it. Story 6. I was on a road trip from Portland to Chicago, and it's nearly a 3-day drive, so I had some places booked to sleep at along the route. I didn't get to particular with what places I chose, but I went with Airbnbs, so I can at least enjoy the road trip a bit more rather than staying in a crowded hotel. My first B&B was in Wyoming, and the route through the state doesn't pass through any big cities really, so it was in a really small town. It was probably no bigger than 2 or 3 miles long. As I passed the border into Wyoming, it started snowing heavily, only dragging. On a long day of driving, by the time I got into town, the roads were covered in snow, and the sun had already set. It was pretty dead, though. I mean, I don't know much about small towns, but this seemed exactly how I thought it would be, especially in a low population state like Wyoming. I was hoping there would be a McDonald's or something that I could get a quick dinner from Vita. It was very clear that there wasn't going to be, so I drove through the town and turned down the road to my Airbnb. It was a long driveway leading up to a small home in the middle of a field with tall snow. Covered pine trees lined up in the front yard. I parked on the side and got out with my bag that walked around to the front. I put in the code and got inside, closing the door behind me and turning on the lights. It was small, probably 500 square feet with just a living room and bedroom. I took my shoes off and dropped my bag in next to the bed, then sat on the couch. When I did, a thump came from the bedroom. I looked back at the doorway way I'd just come from. It was pretty loud, but I had no idea what it could have been. I got up and walked back, looking into the room and turning on the light. It was all the same. I went and checked the small bathroom that was in there as well, but it all looked good, and the only other door in the house was the bedroom closet. I walked over and tugged on the door handle, but it didn't budge. It seems like he was locked from the other side. At first, I was pretty weirded out that a bedroom closet would be kept shut, but then I thought it could have been a maintenance closet. The owner was storing stuff then. There were no other places to put anything, so that was the final conclusion I came to. I went back to the living room and rested my eyes on the couch while thinking through my plan for the next day. After 15 minutes, I got back up and went over to the window looking out to see if the snow was still coming down and if the roads were even going to be drivable tomorrow. It was really dark outside, with no lights from the town showing behind the tall pine trees, and there was still snowing heavily. I shut the blinds and turned back to the couch, but I saw a shadow move in the bedroom. It was slow and smooth, like the shadow to a door opening or closing. I started walking over, listening as I approached the doorway and looked inside the room. I continued looking around until my eyes fell back on the closet. It was still closed, but something gave me an unsettling feeling about it. I stepped up and grabbed the handle, and it opened with ease. It wasn't locked anymore. What inside there wasn't anything, it was just a small and empty walk-in closet. Before I could fully process everything and try to put the pieces together, I heard someone behind me. When I turned around, a large man was standing in the doorway to the bathroom. He looked beaten and tired, having scratches and cut all over his face, and as I stared at him, he didn't even seem to care. He stepped into the bedroom and kneeled down, grabbing a dirty and worn duffel bag from under the bed. The man then stood back up and didn't even look at me as he slowly walked out of the room and out the front door. I ran up and saw him trailing through the snow until he was beyond the lights from the house. I tried to get police involved, but after giving my description, they really only talked to the Airbnb host. After leaving town, I didn't get any more information. I think it's most likely that he was just using the place to sleep or something, but the way he looked makes me second guess that. I just can't even think of what could have happened if I went right to bed that night with the man hiding in the closet just inches away from me. Story 7. I had booked an Airbnb several weeks in advance in a town I'd never been to. A client I was meeting for work lived in the area, so I was only staying there for a day and then driving back home afterward. The drive was 3 hours, and when I pulled into the driveway and got out, the neighborhood it was in was very quiet. Most of the houses' lights were off and trees covered the lawns, blocking out most of the view. The only thing I really saw was a person walking down the road. They were far down, and nothing really looked off about it, but for some reason it just gave me a strange feeling. I went up and unlocked the door, going inside and situating myself. It was a very average house, nothing really special about it or was great for what I needed it for. After making my rounds and checking the place out, I opened the front door to get my other bag from my car. As I stepped onto the porch, though, I noticed someone standing in the road. It was the person I'd seen walking a few minutes ago, but they weren't walking anymore. They were just standing in the road and facing the Airbnb. As I started walking toward my car, they noticed me and started walking away. I kept my eye on them while I was out there getting suspicious about whatever that was. They seemed to just keep walking, though, continuing down the street. I went back inside and made sure it was all locked up, then opened the garage and pulled my car in just to be safe. Throughout the next couple hours, I did a few checks outside to see if that guy was still walking around. I didn't see him anymore, though, and having to get up early the next morning, I went to bed. I slept decently, waking up a few times during the night, but my alarm went off at 4 a.m. for me to finally get up. The sun was still down, so it was still dark outside. but I groggily sat up in my bed and right away saw a light coming under the bedroom door. I didn't remember leaving any lights on, though. I thought I somehow must have just overlooked a kitchen light or something. I got out of bed and walked up to the door, but just before I opened it, I heard something on the other side. It sounded like something moving around at the end of the hallway. I opened the door, seeing it was the living room light that was on, which I immediately knew I definitely would have turned off. The sound continued, though, as I walked down the hallway and looked into the living room. A guy was in the corner searching through one of my bags. He had a black hoodie and ripped up jeans, which was exactly what the person I saw walking around wearing. I only looked at them for a second before they turned around and faced me. He didn't look startled at all. It was almost like he was expecting me. He dropped the bag on the ground and yelled at me to stay where I was. He began making his way over, and I only had a split second to decide what to do. I turned and ran back to the room, slamming the door shut just before he caught up to me. He rammed into it and tried to kick the door down, and then started messing with the lock on the other side. I thought quickly and opened a window, jumping out and running away. By the time I was able to get police there, the man wasn't in the house anymore. My bags were gone too, of course, and to make things more terrifying, the bedroom door was opened. He had picked the lock and gotten in, so if I had just stayed and hid in the bathroom or something, who knows what would have happened. Police seemed to think there was more intense behind this man's actions aside from just robbing, so I pray he doesn't find me again. Earlier this spring, I was camping in the woods 4 hours north of where I lived. There was a small lake that I'd go to a lot. It was never crowded or even really known about. I don't think so, and made for a nice peaceful getaway every time I went. When I got there on the first day and set everything up, nobody else was there. The lake wasn't to beg and was surrounded by a grassy beach with the woods around it, so I could see pretty much all around the lake. Not too long after I arrived, I saw a man come out of the woods on the other side and set up a tent. He looked like an average camper who was keeping to himself for the first little while before sundown, though I saw him making his way around the lake and over toward my campsite. He had a friendly smile and introduced himself as William. He said he wasn't sure if I saw him set up camp or not, but he saw me across the lake and just wanted to say hi. Since we were both out in the middle of nowhere at a lake that nobody usually comes to. We talked for a while, and he was really cool, actually. William was 26, which was around the same age as me, and we both liked this camping spot because of how secluded it was. After talking for 30 minutes, he went back to the other side of the lake as the sun was coming down. Not much else happened that night, but in the morning we ended up talking and hanging out for most of the day. He shared a 6-pack of beers with me, and we sat on the beach and had some good casual conversations. When we went back to our tents at the end of the day, I was sitting by my small campfire. It was really happy I met William. He seemed like the perfect body to go camping with maybe some other time. As it got later, though, I started getting ready to stamp out the fire, go to bed, when I saw William walking around the lake. His campfire had gone out a while ago, so I thought he was in his tent, already sleeping, but apparently not. He walked up to my campfire, and right away, something was different about him. Everything good, man, I said. He smiled. It was suddenly back to how he was before. But he said he came over to ask if I wanted to see a cool spot he found that had a great view. I said it was kind of late to be going out, but he assured me that the view was great because it was dark out. The way he was hiding it up made me feel like I couldn't not see it, and what will be the point in camping out in the woods, but I just passed up the good views. I got up and followed him to the other side of the lake, then trailed behind him as he led us through the woods. But there was no path or anything, so I pretty quickly knew that whatever spot this was, William had to have been there many times before to know the exact way without getting lost, especially out in the dark. We walked for maybe 15 minutes before William started slowing down. He pointed ahead and smiled, like this was the view. But when I walked in front of him and looked, out there was a small structure. It was an old RV or camper that looked like it had been abandoned and succumbed to the elements for years. Moss grew all over it and holes of rust covered the siding. I turned back to look at him, wondering what this was, but his face was now cold and empty. He looked like he was a different person. "William, what is this?" He didn't answer. Feeling a rush of fear started, frantically looking around, and that's when I heard the rusty metal door swings open behind me. I only saw for a quick second as someone else came running out before I started sprinting away. I could hear both William and the other person following close behind. I gave my every strength to keep going until I lost them. By then I'd run so far into the woods that I had no idea where I was. I just kept walking and keeping my eyes on the trees until the sun came up. By the time I found my way back to the lake, I saw from the tree line that all of my camping gear was gone. It looked as if I was never even there. I stayed hidden and got back on the trail, making it back to my car. I made a report with the local police, but they never mentioned finding anything. I don't think they even really looked, to be honest. What was planned for me that night is horrifying. That think about, but at least I got out before having to witness said firsthand. Story 8. I was backpacking through a route I'd found in the Cascades National Park. It was an out and back trail that typically takes 3 days one way and 3 days back. I didn't know too much about it, or how popular of a trail it was, but when doing these long backpacking routes, it usually doesn't matter because you're most likely not run into many people anyway. On my 3rd day out, though, I passed by one of the campsite and saw a man sitting by his tent. I took a break and we talked for a bit, where he mentioned he was staying there for the night and heading to the peak of the trail on the following day. I told him that that's where I was heading today and that I'll probably see him when he gets there. I left shortly after and got to what would be my campsite for the next 2 nights. The view was something I'd never experienced before and made for a great rest day and peak of the trail. For that whole day, nobody passed through, and when it came to night, I was still the only one camping there. I thought back to that guide Mats at the campsite, a day behind me, who said he'd be reaching this trail peak on this day. He never showed up, though. I thought he maybe decided to turn around for some reason, or just camp out for another day at the place he was already at. In the morning, I packed up and started back down the way I came, though I got a late start, so at the very least I was hoping to make it to that same campsite the man was. That I was really sore for some reason, to which didn't help, and before I knew it, there was almost no daylight, love. I put on my headlamp and continued on the trail, walking for another hour past sundown before I made it to the camp. The tent that the man had was still there, set up like he never left. Knowing his plans to continue hiking, and just knowing that staying at one camp for several days while backpacking is unusual, I called out asking if he was okay. There was no response. I walked up a bit closer and said I just wanted to check in on him, but the flap on his tent was partially open and nobody was inside. I felt a lump in my throat, like my body knew something wasn't right. I stood and looked all around, not seeing a single sign of him anywhere, until I saw a glimmer in the distance. There was a faint light sitting still far out in the woods. I began walking up to it, going about 40 yards from the tents, before I found the source. It was a headlamp laying on the ground, like it had been accidentally left behind in the light. It was so dim that it must have been nearly out of batteries. And there was just then that I noticed someone watching me. They were standing not too far, just 10 yards away, and clearly trying to not be seen. I knew him, my God, that this wasn't the man from before, but I felt like I had to say or do something. "Hello? Do you need help?" They stood still and quiet. "I'm sorry, I'll leave," I said shakily, then hurried back to the tent. Luckily, I haven't unpacked anything yet, so I put my backpack on and started walking out of the campsite. As I did, the headlamp in the woods turned off. I got away and walked as far as I could, going another 3 miles to the next camp. I reported it as soon as I could as well, and unfortunately, it was just what I thought it was. The men the eye had met was missing. There's almost no traces for them. The follow went out in the backcountry. It's nearly impossible to search for anyone. Who that person I saw out there was is likely the biggest unknown that could give us answers as to what happened. Though it seems like most of us are aware of the most probable scenario that took place. Story 9. This was about 10 months ago now. I was spending a few days with my best friend from college in his hometown. I'll call him Chris for privacy. It was a really small town from what I was used to. But Chris was showing me around, and we went to the bars and just hung out and had a good time. On my last night there, he mentioned a place he'd been wanting to explore for a while, but hadn't had anyone to go with. It was some abandoned house or town he knew of a few miles out in the woods. We used to go exploring and backpacking all the time in college, so it sounded like a pretty cool idea. Only 30 minutes after hearing about it, we were already trekking through a path in the woods. We still had some sunlight left, but we brought headlamps just in case. About 20 minutes of walking the trail ended, and we had to follow a very faint footpath through the trees. It went on for another hour before we made it. We could see a house out in the distance, and as we got closer, we could see several more behind it. It wasn't what either of us expected, though. The houses didn't really look that old. They looked weathered and heavily damaged, but had modern siding and stuff like that made him look kind of like any other house. There was even a tiny gravel road leading from each of the homes. It looked like maybe they were trying to build a community and something went wrong, causing them to abandon it. Other people had been there before us, though, evident by the graffiti on the sides of the houses. Chris and I went up to the first house, looking through the open doorway. There were weeds growing through the floorboards, but it was otherwise empty. Before we stepped in, though, a loud slamming sound echoed through the woods. Both of us jumped in, stared down the gravel road that we thought it came from. After that sound, though, it was quiet. We had no idea what it was, but after seeing nothing, we went inside the house. There wasn't too much to look at. But what made it so interesting was trying to figure out why anyone would abandon it. The house looks like it would have been nice before it was left behind. After walking around the first floor, we went upstairs to the second. Oddly, it got way darker upstairs, like no windows were letting in any light. The hallway was short with only 2 doors and what looked like an attic in the ceiling. We went up to the first door and opened it, seeing another empty room. But we were quickly interrupted by hearing something downstairs. There were shuffling footsteps coming through the grass and up to the house we were in. We stayed quiet, but we were sure that whoever they were had probably seen us outside, but why would they try to approach us? They walked up to the front doorway, then stopped just before they entered. "Hello?" We didn't respond. "I just want to talk, no harm at all." He sounded older and almost like he was missing teeth or something, stumbling a bit over his words. After that, though, there was a whole minute of silence. He didn't say anything else, but we didn't hear him leave either. We waited another few minutes still, not hearing anything before Chris quietly went down the staircase and looked over at the front door. He turned and looked back at me with a pale face. "There's nobody there." I quickly went to see for myself, but he wasn't lying. He was nowhere in the doorway. We carefully made our way down and over to the doorway. Looking out, there was one line of footprints in the grass coming from where the other houses were, but no footprints leaving. Both of us figured it out at the same time and bolted for the trees, knowing the guy must have been hiding inside the house somehow. We got out of the woods as fast as we could and went back to his place. Who that guy was and why he wanted to talk to us, we don't know, I'm sure. If he'd found us, though, we probably wouldn't be here. Story 10. I was driving across the country for a kind of hectic trip. I had to get some things done for work at an office way up in Maine, and decided that while I was there already on the road trip that I'd visit some of my friends and family on the East Coast.
During my 4th day of driving,
I was spending most of that day going through Pennsylvania. There were a lot of cool towns, but most of the drive was through nothing, and to get where I was going, it was taking me on a lot of side routes, which were these long and empty one-lane highways. As it was getting late, rain started coming down. In my view, all was running low. I hadn't passed in gas stations in a while, so I figured there had to be one soon. But again, this road wasn't really going through any towns. I continued through the rain for another 30 minutes in, barely through the fog. I saw a sign for a gas station, and a couple moments later it showed up ahead of me. It was off the side of the road, nestled in the trees, and was really small. It only had 2 pumps and a tiny concession building behind it. Having no other choice, I pulled Denham Part, getting out and opening up my gas tank. When I pulled the pump off and tried to insert my card, though it didn't work, I wiped the dusty screen and tried to see what it was saying, but it didn't say anything. It wasn't even on. I then went over to the only other pump, and there was also off. Frustrated, I looked around. With it raining and being well past sunset, it was really hard to make anything out. Sure, the place looked old and outdated, but so did a lot of other gas stations. After a closer look, though, I noticed a small light inside the concession building. Hoping it was a worker that could help me, I stepped out from under the overhang covering the palms and ran up to the door. Moisture was covering the entire glass door, so I couldn't see inside. All I could see was the light reflecting through the glass. I grabbed the handle and it screeched open. When I stepped inside, I immediately knew something was wrong. The store shelves were empty, and some even knocked over in the place. Just looked like he was destroyed. The light was coming from somewhere in the back, though it was now clearly some sort of lamprey. Something definitely not a regular store light. I was only in there for a few seconds, and after seeing all of that, I quickly stepped back outside. I didn't know what was going on in there, but I knew it couldn't be anything good and definitely not helpful for my situation. As I backed out of the store and into the rain, I turned around toward my car, but a person was standing next to it. They were completely drenched in water and were just looking around my car and into the windows. What are you doing?" "Hi," I yelled as I quickly made my way up to them. They shot a look at me, then moved their eyes behind me. I turned back to look at the building. The front door was opened and a man came out into the rain. He had long black hair and the sick leave look. He spent no time assessing the situation and instantly started running at me. The other person by my car just backed away as I got inside, but the man running didn't slow down. He came right up to my door and tried opening it, and as I pulled away, a loud metallic scrape vibrated through the car. I spat out of there and back onto the road, making it another half hour before my car ran out of gas. Luckily, I had cell service in the area and was able to get help. While I waited, though, I looked at the outside of my car and saw a huge line going across the door. It looks like the man had run a knife along it when I drove away. Police informed me later that night that the gas station I was at was not in service for at least a decade. Other than that, though, nothing else came of it. And what would have happened if I didn't get out? And time is left to nothing but theories. Story 11. This happened in July of last year. My house was having some pretty big problems and I was left without any power for several days. While I was getting repaired, I worked from home, so this was a major issue. I ultimately had to rent out an Airbnb to stay at for a few days until the power was back on in my home. I don't live in the biggest city, so there weren't too many options for Airbnb near me. The closest one that was at a reasonable price was about a 45-minute drive from my home. It was in an even smaller and secluded area of the city, which was often referred to as not the best section to live in. I was only staying for a few days though, so the amount I was saving was worth it. When I arrived, I went right inside and basically straight to bed, exhausted from everything going on with my house. In the morning, I got up early and started setting up my laptop and workspace. Just before I had to start work though, there was a knock at the door. I debated whether or not open it, because it wasn't even my house, but thinking it might be the host or something, I went up and checked who it was. On the porch was a man, maybe early 30s and covered in tattoos. He didn't look like an Airbnb host or even like a salesperson. Unsure why he was here and not really wanting to know, I figured I'd leave it. I walked away from the door and back to the desk, finishing getting ready and starting work. I had some meetings and a lot of work to catch up on from my absence the last few days. I don't think. I left the desk until 8 p.m., and even then I was considering going back to work after going out and picking up dinner. Only a couple minutes after I got back and started eating, though another knock came at the door. I immediately got up and went to check. Who it was, I wasn't surprised to see it was that same guy from before. What could he possibly want from me this late in the day, though? I was actually more bothered than I was concerned. But again, I just walked away from the door and went back to eat my dinner. After 30 minutes and around 10 p.m., I decided to work for at least another hour. I was tired, but the work had to get done, and I knew putting it off until tomorrow would just make me more stressed. I put my headphones in and tried to focus for the next hour. I got a lot done, and once I was satisfied, I finally closed my laptop for the night. I hadn't realized how dark it had gotten. I guess my laptop screen was the only light I had on. I went to the front and flicked on the light, and a chill instantly rushed through me. Jersey going down the front hallway were faint but unmistakable shoe prints. Looking around, they were all over the place. Even going right up behind the desk I was working at. Terrified, I slowly followed them down to the back door, which was cracked open. I don't even know how to describe what I was feeling. It was just pure horror, and only moments after this, footsteps started coming downstairs. They weren't careful, but when they got to the bottom, a man peered out into the hallway and looked directly at me. It was that same man, easily distinguishable, with all the tattoos and everything, and he looked surprised to see me walking around. But that surprise quickly turned into a rage. His face had no emotions other than irritation and anger. I was going to try to say something, but no words came out, and as my heart started pounding in my chest, I turned right back around and sprinted out the back door. I ran through the backyard and into some trees far behind the houses. I sat behind a tree and pulled my phone out, starting to dial 911, but quickly closed it when I heard footsteps running toward me. I didn't expect them to follow me, but luckily they passed by without seeing me and continued to run out into the dark. Once I got in contact with police, I went back to the Airbnb and waited for them. I gave a detailed description of the man, and they actually found him the next day. It was confirmed to be him by the tattoos I had noticed, and he'd actually broken into several homes in the days leading up, doing horrible things to those who lived in them. I don't know what he was planning to do to me or why he seemed to have left me alone at first, but I can rest easy knowing he won't be able to do anything anymore.